HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Space 2.0, how private spaceflight, a resurgent NASA, and international partners are creating a new space age. By Rod Pyle. Foreword by Buzz Aldrin. Read by Jack Golia. Foreword. About half a century ago, in July of 1969, I participated in a great adventure that was the culmination of the first space age, the first humans to land on the moon. As Neil Armstrong and I climbed down to the desolate expanse of the Sea of Tranquility, with our crewmate, Mike Collins, orbiting overhead, we were cognizant of the vast, organized effort by an entire nation that delivered us safely to that distant body. 5 more landings followed, and just 3 short years later, the Apollo lunar landing program came to an end. This was followed by Earth orbital missions through the Space Shuttle era, and continuing with the International Space Station today. But in many ways, you could say that the first era of space exploration culminated with the return of Apollo 17's crew in 1972. We have not transported humans beyond Earth orbit since that time. And while much has been achieved since then by the United States, Russia, our partners in the ISS, the International Space Station, and now China, it has all been conducted within a few hundred miles of the Earth's surface. That is simply not good enough. The promise of Apollo, felt not just by the astronauts, but by people all over the world, was one of ever greater expeditions to other worlds and in-depth explorations of them by human beings. Apollo was a profound beginning, but the implied promise of that first space age was to explore the moon with long-term habitations, then to reach out beyond to Mars and its moons. Plans were drawn up by both NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the Russians for increasingly ambitious human expeditions into deep space, but soon tucked away in file cabinets. Human spaceflight budgets were slashed, goals reined in, and justifications for these less aggressive programs were put forth. But for many people in all walks of life, myself included, it was an unsatisfying end to a decade of brilliant accomplishment. A bit of spark left the human spirit. Since that time, I've remained active in space exploration efforts, sitting on countless committees and speaking at innumerable venues, in an attempt to drive this important goal forward. I've designed programs such as semi-permanent cycling transports to both the Moon and Mars that would allow for regular and affordable transportation. I've engaged the space community and laymen alike in an effort to enhance understanding of the seminal value of continuing our journey to the stars. I've also been involved with the National Space Society for many years as a member, a leader, and a longtime supporter and active participant. I am now increasingly optimistic that this new era of space exploration and development will dawn during my lifetime, and not just expeditions of exploration, important though they are, but for the long-term settlement of space by human beings. This is the nature of our species, to strive, to overcome limitations, and to move beyond our present boundaries. In the 21st century, this means moving human enterprise into space. In the past few years, I've been delighted to see progressively stronger movement in the private sector toward this goal. A realm long thought to be primarily the domain of governments, low Earth orbit, commonly abbreviated as LEO, and beyond, is being accessed with increasing frequency by companies such as SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, and a growing range of international entities. Although these projects are still being funded to a large extent by government, within a few years I see private investment taking a leading role in these efforts. Internationally, China has joined the United States and Russia in human spaceflight, and India has taken an active role in planetary exploration. Others will follow. This is music to the ears of any former moonwalker, along with millions of others who see a bright future in space. We are witnessing the dawn of a new space age that will finally make traveling into space an affordable and profitable exercise, not just in monetary terms, but also in the full realization of the human spirit. Countless entities, both inside national governments and in boardrooms, and with the advent of new technologies, even in university labs and residential garages, are taking aim at space, each according to their strengths and abilities. We will soon see a zone of convergence in which these parties will both compete and cooperate to regularize a human presence in space, with benefits for all of us. These benefits range from better agricultural practices that will feed additional billions, to limitless clean energy, to the expansion of human communities beyond Earth. The bounty to be reaped from a truly robust presence in space is impossible to overstate. An intelligently planned and consistent expansion into space holds promise for virtually everyone on Earth. Please join me as we explore the next few decades in spaceflight in this important new book, produced in partnership with the National Space Society, and explore humanity's movement into the universe. It's time to get us off this planet and to realize our destiny in space. Buzz Aldrin, astronaut and global space statesman, National Space Society Board of Governors. Chapter 1. Space 1.0, The Final Act. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people together to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, author and pioneering aviator. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Elon Musk, founder of SpaceX. July 8, 2011, could have been any other summer day on the Florida coast. The sky was a stunning blue. A warm breeze blew across the tidelands, and the green water offshore was glassy. But this was not just another day in the Sunshine State. Before me was a billboard-sized digital clock, slowly counting down towards zero, and 3 miles beyond that stood a space shuttle, shimmering in the midday heat. Billows of white vapor spewed from its orange fuel tank as the ultra-cold liquid oxygen boiled off as if anxious to be ignited. Atlantis appeared ready to bolt into the heavens. This morning would host the 135th and final launch of the Space Shuttle program, an exciting event, as all launches are, but also one swaddled in both hope and wistfulness. The hope hinged on the up-and-coming NASA partnership with commercial space providers SpaceX and Boeing, who were building the presumed replacements for the shuttle's delivery of astronauts to the International Space Station, ISS. The wistfulness was for the end of the first era of human spaceflight, Space 1.0, which began with the early Mercury program and culminated in the Space Transportation System, more commonly known as the Space Shuttle. The shuttle program had been America's premier space effort for over 30 years. It had returned us to space in 1981 after the 6-year post-Apollo lull. The last Apollo spacecraft flew in 1975. Conducted countless experiments in orbit, deployed and repaired the Hubble Space Telescope, docked repeatedly with the Soviet Mir space station, and built the International Space Station. While the shuttle never fully realized its intended destiny as a more affordable and reusable means of reaching space than its predecessor, the shuttle was complex, delicate, dangerous, and expensive to refurbish. The fleet served NASA for more than 3 decades, providing relatively routine access to low Earth orbit. The July 2011 launch represented the final act of the program. Atlantis' primary payload that day was a Europe-supplied component called the Multipurpose Logistics Module, Atlantis carried only 4 astronauts instead of the normal 6 or 7, due to the fact that there were no more shuttles available for rescue in case of an in-flight emergency. If a problem occurred, the astronauts would have to take shelter in the ISS, and 4 was the maximum number that could be safely accommodated there. As the countdown reached its final seconds, a gush of water erupted at the base of the launch pad to absorb the massive acoustic shock from the rocket engines that would soon pummel the flame trench. A bright flicker emanated from the base of the shuttle, and a tremendous volume of smoke billowed outward as the engines came up to full power. Moments later, at T-0, the side-mounted solid rocket boosters ignited, and Atlantis leapt skyward, departing on its final journey at 11:29 a.m. A deep rumble washed over us a few seconds later as the spacecraft climbed slowly skyward, gaining speed and riding a column of smoke into the east. As the smiling crowd slowly departed the stands, a sense of finality settled over me. Nobody knew for certain when another rocket would depart from Pad 39. America's future in human spaceflight was dependent on new partnerships with private aerospace companies, an arrangement that was in flux. It could be years before U.S. astronauts departed from the Cape Canaveral, again. As the spectators headed home, Atlantis made its way to the space station. Before docking, it paused about 600 feet away for astronauts already aboard the ISS to give the shuttle's tile-covered underbelly and the leading edges of its wings a thorough inspection. Those tiles and the reinforced carbon composite shells that made up the front ends of the wings would be its sole protection from the incandescent heat of re-entry it would face in just under 2 weeks. NASA had learned the hard way that damage to these elements of the thermal protection system could result in catastrophe, as had occurred 8 years earlier with the shuttle Columbia. A piece of foam insulation from the fuel tank had broken free during launch and impacted the leading edge of the left wing, punching through the thin reinforced carbon composite there, dooming Columbia and its crew. The Columbia accident was the second loss of a space shuttle since Challenger exploded in 1986, and just one more in a long list of flights in which protective thermal coverings were damaged during launch, imperiling the crew. This fragility was one of a number of technical factors that led to the termination of the shuttle program. With that solemn assessment complete, Atlantis docked with the ISS. Then the shuttle's mission continued for its 12-day duration. Atlantis returned home for the last time on July 21, 2011, was decommissioned, and now resides in a museum display at the Kennedy Space Center, locked in a permanent orbit around a huge rear-projected image of the Earth. The end of the shuttle program created a yawning gap in America's ability to fly humans into space. The Constellation program, initiated by President George W. Bush in 2004, was intended to create a replacement for the shuttle, a cheaper, expendable rocket and capsule designed along the lines of the Apollo spacecraft of the 1960s. This new program was also supposed to have the capability to return astronauts to the surface of the Moon. But Constellation, continually overscheduled and under-budgeted, was canceled by President Obama in 2010 after a program review by aerospace experts. So the shuttle program came to an end without a replacement. Let me repeat that. America was giving up its sole functioning capability to fly astronauts to the space station that we had designed and built at staggering expense without a domestic replacement. This stunned much of the spaceflight community, and a lot of people, including a number of Apollo-era astronauts, were quite vocal in their dissent. Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the Moon, Jim Lovell of Apollo 13 fame, and Gene Cernan, the last man to depart the lunar surface, all strongly condemned the decision. In an open letter to the president, the 3 former astronauts explained that the choice to cancel the Constellation program was, quote, devastating, unquote. The letter continued, America's only path to low Earth orbit and the International Space Station will now be subject to an agreement with Russia to purchase space on its Soyuz, until we have the capacity to provide transportation for ourselves. The ability of a commercial transport to orbit as envisioned in the President's proposal cannot be predicted with any certainty, but is likely to take substantially longer and be more expensive than we would hope. Their assessment of the pace at which commercial spaceflight could develop alternatives to deliver astronauts to orbit turned out to be prophetic. While much progress has been made since that final shuttle launch, many experts suggest that commercial spaceflight partnerships have been consistently underfunded, and the contractors that will be providing astronaut transportation to the ISS, Boeing and Elon Musk's SpaceX, have been running behind schedule. While nobody can say how the Constellation program would have turned out, the U.S. has suffered a significant gap in human spaceflight capability since the end of the shuttle program. The shuttle's temporary replacement, the Russian Soyuz, was to cost NASA $32 million per seat for each American astronaut that flew to the ISS. That sounds expensive, but was on its surface much cheaper than flying on the shuttle, which cost a minimum of $71 million per person. This represented a large cost savings over the development of the Constellation program, if low Earth orbit were your only destination. But Constellation promised the ability to send missions to the Moon and eventually to Mars, so the numbers are difficult to compare. Constellation would also have been capable of delivering much larger, heavier payloads to orbit. In the short term, buying seats on Soyuz seemed like a bargain, but it was not. By 2017, that price had risen to $81.7 million, arguably more per passenger than the shuttle, and with far less capability. Not such a bargain anymore. There are a number of reasons for this discomfort with the Soyuz as a delivery vehicle, besides the direct per-person launch costs. While the Russian launches were, initially, cheaper, the use of the Soyuz restricted American astronauts to Russian flight schedules, which were often erratic. U.S. astronauts would have to train at Russian space facilities, which represented an added expense. The Soyuz capsules were also much smaller than the shuttle's crew compartment, carrying a maximum of 3 astronauts, as opposed to the shuttle's complement of 7. Finally, manned Soyuz flights were unable to carry a meaningful amount of cargo to the station, so the U.S. would end up paying for robotic cargo flights to offset what the shuttle was no longer delivering. There was an additional objection contained in the letter from the 3 astronauts that went beyond complaints about Russian pricing and the uncertain future of commercial spaceflight, one more philosophical in nature. They continued, "Without the skill and experience that actual spacecraft operation provides, the U.S. is far too likely to be on a long downhill slide to mediocrity. America must decide if it wishes to remain a leader in space. If it does, we should institute a program that will give us the very best chance of achieving that goal." Their contention was that the U.S., a premier power in spaceflight, was ceding the ability to get people into space, and perhaps, more crucially, its ability to operate large human spaceflight programs in the future. In response, the Obama administration outlined plans to spend more money to support development of human-rated spacecraft in the private sector, and to salvage parts of the Constellation program, an evolution of Constellation's heavy booster, now dubbed the Space Launch System, SLS, and the Orion capsule. To many observers, this represented a welcome change in priorities. NASA would continue to build, albeit very slowly, its own space capsule and large rocket, which would carry a human crew to rendezvous with an asteroid in the 2020s. NASA would additionally direct funding to private spaceflight companies such as SpaceX and Boeing to deliver astronauts and supplies to the ISS. There was one major bug in the ointment, however. The asteroid redirect mission, ARM, or ARM as it came to be known, while a valid demonstration of technology and engineering was not popular. It appeared on the surface to be a program invented more to give Orion SLS something to do rather than being a valid science and engineering program. ARM died with the start of the Trump administration and has since been replaced with a NASA initiative to return to the moon. This is where we find ourselves near the end of the second decade of the 21st century. Regardless of the destination plan for Orion SLS, both vehicles have been consistently behind schedule and over budget. But the Orion SLS system continues to move forward and is currently slated for a maiden flight in 2020. The realpolitik of the programs involves a great number of jobs in a few NASA facilities and aerospace contractors in various congressional districts, always important political considerations. At the same time, NASA funding for private sector efforts has fallen short of its own stated goals most years since 2010. SpaceX, Boeing, and other commercial space providers continue to vie for increased government funding for commercial spaceflight capability. NASA's overarching plan is for the commercial providers to handle transporting people and cargo to the International Space Station, while Orion SLS handles NASA's human exploration plans beyond low Earth orbit. This scenario may sound a bit bifurcated, with too little money being spent in two connected camps, but there are reasons for optimism. In early 2017, the Trump administration reactivated a government oversight group called the National Space Council. This body had existed twice before, once between 1958 and 1973, and then again from 1989 to 1993. Its mandate is to tackle long-range policies for American goals in space, reporting directly to the executive branch, with the plan then being implemented by NASA and other federal departments. The council is chaired by the vice president, and it's composed of top space policymakers, cabinet-level government officials, and the NASA administrator. It is advised by a selection of aerospace professionals from companies old and new. The Council has created recommendations for how NASA can best move ahead, both with its own efforts and with continued funding for the private sector. The preferred balance it seeks is for the private sector companies to be properly funded to do what they can do best, create a set of robust, low-cost spaceflight capabilities to get humans and cargo into orbit, and to compete among themselves to improve these services for increasingly lower costs. The two companies currently developing a contracted capability to deliver astronauts to the ISS are SpaceX and Boeing. SpaceX is building and flying the Falcon 9 rocket, which is already running regular cargo supply missions to the ISS, and is poised to begin flying astronauts to the station in 2019 or 2020. It has independently developed and flown the Falcon Heavy Mega Booster, but this is not as yet part of NASA's commercial program. Boeing and United Launch Alliance, ULA, have their own contracts with NASA, and a Boeing-built capsule called the Starliner will soon be launching atop ULA's Atlas rockets to deliver crews to the ISS. These traditional aerospace companies know that they must adapt or die in this new environment, and are working hard to compete with SpaceX. Northrop Grumman Innovation Systems, via the acquisition of Orbital ATK, among other commercial entities, flies cargo missions to the ISS under contract to NASA. Sierra Nevada Corporation, a company that is experimenting with a mini space shuttle, is preparing to join in these cargo runs. For decades, the U.S. and Russia were the only countries flying humans into space, but this is changing. China launched the first crewed mission of its human spaceflight program in 2003 and has lofted 2 small space stations of its own. Throughout the book, the word crewed refers to a situation with a crew, spelled CREWED. India is poised to follow with human spaceflight capability by 2022. Clearly, new international players and the U.S. commercial sector are gaining traction in an area that has been, since 1961, the exclusive domain of government agencies within the two major Cold War superpowers. These developments are heartening, as they represent a strong shift in favor of more frequent, less expensive, and more diversified access for humans to travel into space. But back in 2011, as I watched the smoky trail of Atlantis dissipate over the Kennedy Space Center, these were still mostly tantalizing promises. SpaceX would not make its first cargo run to the ISS until 2012. Boeing was just beginning work on the Starliner, and China was striving to deliver the first crew to its tiny Tiangong-1 orbiting laboratory. These were hopeful beginnings, but it was, at the time, far from certain how any of these efforts would play out. As I traveled home from Florida, I reflected upon the circuitous route that U.S. space activities and those of other nations had taken since the 1960s. I thought about how the Apollo spacecraft had been replaced by the shuttle, ending our efforts for human exploration beyond Earth orbit. I reflected on what alternative paths might have been followed and what the results might have been. I balanced these notions with positive thoughts about the rise of private spaceflight and China's nascent efforts. One thing became increasingly clear as I pondered the future. Whatever the next few decades held in store, the results were unlikely to resemble the first space age. And that was a good thing. Since the late 1970s, many space advocates have pined for another Kennedy moment, when an American president or foreign leader, probably Russian, would stride to a podium and announce a daring, large-scale government program to accomplish aggressive new goals in space, such as JFK, John F. Kennedy, did when he announced the Apollo lunar landing program in 1961. 3 U.S. presidents have made similar announcements, but none have stuck like the lunar landing challenge did. And little wonder. Kennedy's announcement, which kicked off the space race, was motivated primarily by geopolitics and was very much a product of its time. It is not a moment likely to be reenacted in the 21st century. The world has moved on from the Cold War tensions of binary superpowers. We are now in a far better position to embark upon a sustainable program of human spaceflight and space development, and toward a permanent, robust human presence off Earth that will offer wide-ranging benefits for everyone who participates, directly or indirectly. Welcome to Space 2.0. Chapter 2. A Dark and Forbidding Place. Space hates people. Don't let that put you off, though. Well over 500 humans have traveled its reaches, and most have returned safely. These brave individuals flew because they felt it was worth it, despite knowing the substantial risks involved. I've never met an astronaut who would not willingly accept a reasonable amount of danger to accomplish a mission. Space is not a place that naturally lends itself to human travel and habitation, however, and much must be done to get people there and keep them safe, even for short periods of time. Let's look at launch first. Why is getting into orbit such a challenge? Space is just overhead, and the unofficial boundary is only 62 miles above us. The International Space Station orbits every 90 minutes at an altitude of just 250 miles. Without the snarl of city traffic, you could drive that far in about 4 hours. But as it turns out, going up as opposed to going across is much more difficult. And to reach orbit, you must go extremely fast. That requires a lot more energy than moving across the Earth's surface, and harnessing that energy is tricky business. When carrying a spacecraft into orbit, rockets must aim from the surface of the Earth in a curving path high above the equator, and then apply a lot of force to overcome the clutches of gravity to travel high enough and fast enough to reach and stay in orbit. So while you might...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?